So, Dustin, you have been working with businesses for years. What is the best piece of advice you can give them when they're deciding to buy or sell businesses?
Well, I would say the number one mistake that I see people make when they are buying or selling a business for the first time is they wait too long to get their attorney involved.
Sure.
And I can tell you countless horror stories and deals that have fallen apart at the 11th hour that probably could have been avoided by an attorney being involved much earlier in the process.
At what point do you recommend business owners get someone involved in buying and selling their businesses?
Well, I think it's helpful to first understand, like, what are the basic steps? I think of it as like 6 milestones in a typical sale transaction. So you have the initial negotiations where, buyer and seller, maybe there's a broker involved, and they're just talking about a purchase price and is there even a deal to talk about at that point.
Sure.
Then you have the letter of intent phase. Once a letter of intent gets executed, then typically the next step is the due diligence phase, where the buyer is kind of looking under the hood and looking under all the rocks and figuring out, do they really want to buy this business? Then you get to the point where the lawyers are definitely involved by this point.
Okay.
Where they start to draft and negotiate all the contracts.
Okay.
Then you have a closing, and then usually there is some post-closing transition or some work that needs to be done after the closing.
Okay.
So those are the 6 main steps of a typical sale transaction. And I recommend that people should get their lawyer involved really as early as possible. There's not a whole lot for an attorney to do in that first step, which is the initial negotiations.
Right.
That's typically just the buyer and the seller and maybe a broker having some conversations to see if there's even a deal to be made. But anything beyond that is really when I would want to step in and be deeply involved in that letter of intent phase.
Okay.
Because there is a lot of value that an attorney can add to having a really good letter of intent that will make the transaction much smoother going forward.
Sure. So what happens if they call you at the 11th hour and you haven't been involved in the process this whole time?
Well, a lot of deals fall apart. The reality is I have a lot of situations where someone will call me and say something like, hey, the whole deal's negotiated, the contracts are drafted, we've got a closing in 2 weeks, and I just need a lawyer to lay their eyes on these documents before the closing. And my response is typically, no thanks, I don't want to have anything to do with that.
Sure.
Because 100% of the time, if I'm coming in at that late phase, I'm going to see problems in the contract. I'm going to see things that I really think, this should have been done differently.
So let's say I'm a business owner and I call you and I tell you that I want to try to save as much money as possible. And I tell you that I'm not going to bring you in till later. Do you think that's the best way to try to save costs?
Well, that's a good way to maybe spend a little bit less money on a lawyer, but it's a good way to also probably lose the whole deal.
Sure.
And so, like anything else, spending a little bit of money up front on prevention is generally going to pay significant dividends, especially in this case, because if the deal comes together and you have a closing, that's what you want ultimately. And so I've seen that situation where people think, okay, well, I'm already paying a broker 8%
right.
or 10%. I'm going to have to pay a bunch of money in taxes.
Right.
If you're on the seller side. And so the mentality sometimes is, well, I want to save as much money as I can on a lawyer. And so I'm going to do as much that I can myself. And then again, once I feel like we're getting close to a closing, then I'll bring a lawyer in to lay their eyes on things. And again, most good business lawyers who do this kind of work for a living are going to decline those engagements.
Sure.
Because we've just seen too many deals go bad. And if a deal falls apart, you look at it and say, okay, well, I didn't have to pay the broker, so that was good. And I'm not going to have to pay the taxes.
Sure.
And I didn't have to pay the lawyer a bunch of money, but, the whole deal fell apart. And if you're a seller, for example, maybe it's a $5 million deal and, you're losing out on a significant amount of money. I've also seen situations where, people on the buyer side where, they are spending a lot of money on due diligence. They're paying their lawyers to analyze and investigate this business. They're paying their accountants to investigate everything. And the deal falls apart at the 11th hour and they're left with nothing except maybe they've spent $10 or $20 or $30,000 or more on legal and accounting and other experts, and they've got nothing to show for it. And sometimes I look at a deal like that that's fallen apart and I figure out, okay, well, why did this deal go south? What happened? And I hate to say it, but a lot of times it's, an attorney with experience would have prevented this. They could have predicted it.
Sure.
There could have been things done differently at the letter of intent phase that might have perhaps set this transaction on a better trajectory, and it would have ended up closing.